What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. And today we have an interview, so I'm not critically analyzing apologist arguments or anything. I'm talking with Dr. Jennifer Bird here about her book, which I've got a physical copy of, Marriage in the Bible, this is a topic that I've really kind of been focusing on here lately just because of the almost visceral reaction I get from Christians as well as atheists on occasion whenever I talk about the treatment of women in the Bible and just in general the relationships, how relationships are portrayed in the Bible. And I got Dr. Jennifer Bird who wrote the book Marriage in the Bible, and I've been pounding through it. I'm only 77 pages in, so I'm about nearly halfway through it, and I'm going to continue. I read it when I can. And I just want to say, great book so far. But Dr. Bird, do you want to sort of introduce yourself to who you are, what you do, and all that kind of stuff?
Absolutely, sure. The things I think that relate to me in this context and in terms of my book, right? So I am a biblical scholar. So I have a PhD in New Testament and early Christianity. I got that from Vanderbilt in 2007. I did go to seminary before that. Seminary is a 3-year degree. So I went to Princeton Theological Seminary, and that's where things kind of kicked off in a very different direction for me. I can say that growing up, I was part of a Methodist family, Christian, United Methodist, and I took a really hard swing to the right theologically in my teens and 20s. So I was an evangelist, not just evangelical, but I was an evangelist for a few years, 6 years or so. And I was reading the Bible very literally, relatively speaking, pretty literally, and then I had someone show me a way to read the Mary and Martha passage that radically changed the way I saw that passage, but it also did something for me personally. And when she showed me that, I thought, she's attending to the Greek, and that's honoring the Greek in this passage, and it changed something for me. What else is out there that I'm missing, right? So that's what sent me to seminary eventually. So I went to seminary very conservative, very, this is God's word, inspired, all that, and memorizing lots of passages and bringing people to Jesus. And I left a very different person because I started thinking about things a little bit differently. And, when people today talk about deconstructing something like that, right? I went through that process, but it wasn't being called that at the time. And I think what I went through was more like being better informed. I became better educated on these topics, all of it, like, learning the biblical languages, biblical Hebrew, Greek, and eventually I learned Aramaic, or studied it, I should say. Like that, but also like the history of the church and the history of dogma and the history of all the ideas. And so everything just, when you start to look at that for yourself instead of just agreeing with all of it, that just changed something for me. So anyway, so that's why I ended up going to PhD work, so I could be hopefully taken a little bit more seriously. And this topic, marriage in the Bible, is important to me for the reasons you mentioned already, right? Women, how are relationships depicted, but also the issue of marriage equality. Like I am for, I'm an ally. I'm for marriage equality, but I'm also not interested in telling people what to think or believe about things. So I wrote this book because I know so many people who are both like either Christian and in churches, and they want to affirm same-sex marriage, or people who are who aren't religious, but they don't understand why people who are get so hung up on these things, right? So I wanted to help people. I wanted to offer a space, a way for people to, this is what's going on, to think about it for yourself, and then decide, is that something you want to be importing into the present, right? So that, there's a lot, I think, going on in this book, but I'm interested in helping people sit with the passages, sit with the biblical text first. I'm not trying to make them say what I want them to say, right? So, and then we can talk about, well, okay, how does that relate to today or not? Or oh my goodness, this is still playing out in our lives today. And perhaps part of the reason for that is because people are so well informed and trained by these passages and ways of thinking about relationships and so forth. So I hope that's not too long of an intro. I wasn't sure
No.
how long to talk about myself here, but it's a really important book to me. It feels like a culmination of about 30 years of life and experience and trying to have these conversations with people. So yeah, it's an important book to me. So I hope it helped,
Yeah.
and I hope it helps some people. That's it, right?
I mean, it's already helped me, and I'll
Mm,
get into that here
mm,
in a second. It was the same things that I talked to you about before we went
mhm,
live, but
mhm.
I do want to say that something you said in your intro there reminded me that it was about you sort of going deeper into like the biblical languages and everything like
Mhm,
that.
mhm.
I've actually, as I've engaged more people like on topics in the Bible and everything like that, I've actually been called by another atheist a closeted Christian. Uh, but because I take the time to like understand the biblical languages, like I would not say that I'm literate like
Mhm.
in either Koine Greek or Hebrew, but I know how to look up words and understand the context and use like a lexicon in order to understand like what they're actually saying in the passage. Like I
Okay.
know how to do that, and
Okay.
so in doing that, I've had people be like, "Are you sure you're not a Christian? Because you're sounding Christian right now." Because they were an atheist making like really kind of outrageous comments about like I believe it was Paul's letters, and he
Mm,
was changing words around. I was like, oh, okay, well let's go back to the original Greek. And so I would like,
okay.
pull up an interlinear and I'd look at it and we'd examine the words that are used in the right context and everything. And so it was like, "Are you Christian? Like, are you really a Christian here? Because you're making a Christian argument." I'm like, "No, I'm just."
I'm just trying to
Yeah,
honor the text, right?
right,
You don't have to
exactly.
have any specific set of beliefs in order to want to respect the text, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Which kinda leads us into our first topic that I want to talk about. Because in your book, Marriage in the Bible, which everybody I have linked down below, if you want to go and hit that up, and you can get it either on Kindle or physical hard copy like I've got both. But um, I like having the Kindle version because then I can just search up topics if I need to, like,
Mhm,
after I finish reading it. Like, if I
mhm.
know it's in there and I don't know where exactly, I can
Remember where it
just
was.
search it.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you start out the book primarily talking about two Genesis passages that are primarily used to sort of establish traditional marriage. I'm wondering if you can kind of briefly go over that and talk about like what these passages actually mean, and
Mm.
what what the verbiage or the language that's used there. What does that indicate? Like the author's thought about as far as relationships go between men and women.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, just that. Okay, and how much time did you
I'm
say we
sorry.
have?
I know.
I
It's
know,
it's
I
it's
know.
a lot.
It's all good. It's all good. I love it really because you're getting at what's going on here and what it's what matters. So, okay, so the first 2 chapters, well, just let me just say briefly that the first 4 chapters in this book, are the 4 biblical passages that Christians usually refer to help them define this concept of biblical marriage. So, that would be Genesis 1:28 and Genesis 2:24, which you just asked me to discuss, and then also Matthew 19, 4-6, and Ephesians 5, 31 and 32. So they each of those passages gets a chapter in this book. So Genesis 1:28 is the passage that says, I'm just gonna make sure I don't misquote it because I off the top of my head I sometimes miss boop-a-doo. uh God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." And then, of course, it goes on to, thank you, yeah. Um, Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and of the birds of the air and over living things. But the part that people quote is just that first part, right? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So, so Genesis 1. Okay, so when I talk about what's going on in these stories, in these biblical passages, I want to talk about what is this story doing? Like chapter 1 of Genesis, and it kind of spills over into chapter 2, is one of the first 2 creation stories, right? Most people think of Genesis 1 and 2 as one story that the Genesis 1 is the daily thing, and then Genesis 2 is just giving us more specifics. That's how most people are taught to read it. But they're actually two separate stories, and they actually have a different order of creation, and they're talking about different things. And that's a whole thing to get into, which we won't get into now, but it's a part of what I try to help people see, right? That so that we're going to honor, like you were just talking about, right? Let's honor what's going on in these stories. What are they trying to communicate? What are they trying to talk about? So, the first creation story is doing this daily, creation thing. And then at the end, on the final day, all the land animals and so all the mammals and humans are created. And so when you look at the story overall, God looks at the fish in the sea and says, "Be fruitful and multiply." He's probably not telling them to go get married.
Right.
And then the land animals, right? Everybody's supposed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And the humans, of course, are the ones being given that particular, command in this case. But that's just what we're doing. What the story is doing or talking about is this big picture about, the world and, human relationships, partnering up and reproducing is just a part of that. Be fruitful and multiply. When people say that this is God ordaining marriage, or this is God's idea for marriage, that it needs to be between a man and a woman because only a man and woman can reproduce, right? That is putting onto this passage our current needs and expectations about things, right? I realized when I was actually not long before I wrote the book. So when I was getting into this work, trying to help people see what is actually being said about marriage in the Bible, I realized I was reading this passage through the lens of marriage because they're going to have sex. If you're going to reproduce, it requires sex. And so I was putting onto this passage that God is talking about marriage.
Mhm.
But really, it's just talking about a general thing about life. In fact, really, or to come at it differently, it's not like they needed that command in order to get out there making babies, like get busy making babies, right? The animals on the planet and the fish in the sea weren't going to, they were waiting for that command in order to reproduce. No, nobody needs to be told to get busy making babies and having sex, right? So the story is talking about something bigger and, in a sense, more generic than specifically being about marriage. Um, and there's no language about marriage, right? It's just that he's looking at humans and get out there and do your thing, right? It's more like and in fact, most Jewish contexts, this is seen as a blessing, right? It's seen as may you be fruitful, like go do your thing, the thing you want to get busy doing. And another way to look at this is to look at the next verse. So people look at Genesis 1:28 as if it's this universal command that you need to get busy making babies and you can only do it on but then people don't even know what 129 says, which is hilarious because it says that we're supposed to be vegans. Right? I mean,
Well, I mean,
go ahead.
if you ask Ken Ham,
Oh, dear.
everybody was a vegan, even the carnivores that were in the Garden of Eden. He's got a book. I've got it somewhere here. He's got a book where he's got this Tyrannosaurus Rex with these sharp teeth, and it's like eating an apple. So or
Oh, yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Okay. It's funny, but it's also he needs the Bible to be right,
Mhm.
because it suggests here in Genesis 1 that even all of the animals are only eating vegetation, right? Which isn't true, right?
Right.
So, oof, Ken Ham. Anyway, um, yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like maybe I haven't done this one justice this morning very well, but be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Like that's not a command specifically about marriage. Is the starting point here for me? It's not about marriage. It's about God in a sense in the story blessing not entirely, not everyone wants to get married, not everyone wants to have sex, right? But most people, most beings have a desire to reproduce and all that. So that's one of the things that's the main thing I think for now about Genesis 1:28. Genesis 2:24 is actually my favorite to talk about because what? Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Before we move on from that,
Yes, please.
generally, how is this verse used, like, in the discussion on traditional marriage and, like,
Oh.
marriage equality?
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of biblical marriage, it's used to say only a man and a woman can get married because only a man and a woman can reproduce.
Mhm.
And for me, in the context of marriage equality thinking, not that I'm trying to turn this into something that supports what I think, because that's not, I don't want to do that. But for me, I think it's looking, we need to pull back from it and see what is it talking about. And so, there are all kinds of ways that humans show up in the world that are different from any particular command in the Bible, right? Like we
Mhm.
can't all do all the things, or we aren't all geared for, not all women actually want to be happy homemakers, like it's just a generic, right? But
Yeah.
many of the biblical passages make it seem like we should be. But that forcing us to do that just because we have certain body parts, like that doesn't work, right? So that's my approach to, let's just see what it's talking about instead of seeing it as a command for all time. Does that make sense, what I'm getting at
Yeah.
here? Yeah.
Mhm. Definitely.
Okay.
Okay, so, let's, move on to 2:24.
Yeah.
I'll bring that up right here.
Yeah. And I appreciate you using the NRSV updated edition and not NIV, for instance. If you really
Oh,
were
yeah. No,
a closeted Christian, you'd be using NIV.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't like using the NIV. That's probably my least favorite other than the KJV. And I've just I try to keep up with like what is the best version to use.
It's
And
hard
so
to know.
recently I've heard multiple different
Mhm.
like scholarly people say that the NRSV UE is the one that you would want to use if you're looking critically at the Bible and everything. So that's what I try to use.
Yeah, I'm impressed. Yeah, it's a matter of debate, to be honest, but that's feels relatively safe for me.
Yeah.
But so, yes, but this is one of the really classic, like, but this is most English translations don't do justice to this verse, and that's the main point here. So, when I first discovered that the language in the Hebrew here says we should read this, therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his woman, and they become one flesh. And the first time I sat with that and just really sat with that, right? Wait a minute. The Hebrew doesn't have a noun to differentiate between woman and wife, and the Hebrew doesn't have a noun to differentiate between man and husband. We do, because that difference is important to us, but the Hebrew didn't. And here, the translators have all made a decision. They've all made a decision to make this be about marriage specifically by importing married language. So when they say, therefore, a man leaves his father and mother, clings to his wife, then it's okay for them in the next part of the verse to then cling together, which is which is implying they're going to have sex, right?
Mhm.
I wish I wish I'd recorded a couple times when I made this announcement, or like when I kind of talked this through with students in person, and just to watch all the faces. They're like, "What? They don't get married? That's not marriage?" In this verse this verse and the verse in 1 Corinthians 7, about if you're too passionate, go get married, that'll help you put out the passion, actually. These 2 verses are used to say that sex before marriage is a sin.
Mhm.
But in the Hebrew Bible, there isn't a verb to marry. There isn't a way to differentiate between pre and post pairing up. So so and other biblical passages make it very clear that men can have sex prior to and outside of marriage, and it's not an issue at all. So So anyway, so this verse, again, in context, look at what the story is saying. What is this chapter saying and getting at? Well, this chapter is really, you see the opening where, God, there's the gardens and the rivers and all this stuff. And then God forms a human, not a man, but a human out of the dirt. And we think it's a man because of the pronouns used, and because the name Ha-Adam, whatever. So it gets turned into Adam. But the first human was actually generic, no gender, just a human. And the language and the conversation is around this thing about it's not good for the human to be alone. That's the premise that's laid out there up front. Like, you've got this human, but the human is alone, and that's not good. So let's find the human a partner. And the language there I like to talk about, but I don't want to spend too much time on these details here. But the partner as its equal is what they're looking at, not a subservient. But anyway, so you get to verse 23, and it says, therefore, where he's pulled some of the side out to make another human, and breathes life into them both, and all that stuff. And so they're, out of this one shall be called woman, for out of man she was taken. Well, once you have male and female, once you have two, that's when you have male and female. Prior to there being two, when it was just one, it was a generic human, Ha-Adam. Now it's Ish and Isha, a man and woman, now that we have two. And this is where people get hung up, I think, on the wrong thing. This is a story, I think, that is trying to talk about a nearly, but not entirely, a nearly universal desire that humans have to find a partner, to partner up, to have a life companion, to do, to share your life with, right? It's not specifically talking about the institution that we call marriage. It's talking about human desire, human need, the need for relationship, which to me it might sound subtle, but it's a pretty significant shift in terms of where you're putting the emphasis. Mm-hmm. So this verse, in every English translation I've looked at, implies marriage, but the Hebrew isn't. If you look at the story in the Hebrew, it's not talking about a human institution. It's talking about a human desire on the level of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Just a little anecdotal story from me. I actually, after I read this part in your book where you talk about this language distinction here, I mentioned that to a Christian in a live that I was doing, and I was like, there's no actual verb in the Hebrew language that means like to marry or distinguishes a married individual. Yeah. And he was like, no, there is. He copies the Hebrew word that you specify. It means to take or taken. And he's like, that means marry. I'm like, no, that means to take.
That's what this person did this live with you.
Yeah.
Holy crap. Yeah. I mean, and so I share charts actually in that chapter, as well as I think in chapter 5, where I'm talking about more terminology, just to highlight that. Sorry, I just unplugged my headphones. To highlight that, a lot of translation committees have chosen to translate lakach as marry, but they also all agree in these other situations it's just to take, right? And so, why is taking a woman being called marrying her, right? This is it's a redirect, it's a misdirect, or it's a don't pay attention what's going on behind the curtains. This is a man takes a woman, so back to your point and your questions. I kind of get off on tangents sometimes.
No, that's perfectly fine.
Okay. The translation committees have they're misleading us, right? When they translate, go and take a woman as go and marry a woman. They're misleading us because we have mostly nice, lovely connotations associated with marrying. Maybe not everybody does, but in their context, he's literally just going out and taking her. There's no mutuality. There's no vows being exchanged. We're not committing to each other for life. I get students talking about it through their lenses, right? My lens is that I'm going to commit to someone hopefully for the rest of my life and love them and be, whatever. Like, great. That's not what they're talking about here. And so translation committees are misleading us over, and that builds up, so that to the point where I think we should remove from both testaments, the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament, which is my way of referring to the Old Testament and New Testament, we should remove marrying verbs from the Hebrew Bible, and we should remove any reference to husband and wife in both testaments, because neither, even in the Greek and the Newer Testament, there isn't a way to differentiate between man and husband or woman and wife. It's in the passages in the Newer Testament where it talks about husbands, do this with your wives, and wives, be submissive to your husband. No, it's just woman, be submissive to your man or to the man or whatever, right? Men, do this with the women. Like, it's not, I mean, the originals are much more raw. And so people are trying to make it more palatable instead of showing us what they were thinking and doing and talking about at the time. And so, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. I was just going to ask, would you call that being anachronistic, like in inserting like our modern understanding onto this older text, sort of overriding what the original Hebrews or later on the Jews would have like thought about relationships?
Such a great question. Such a great question. I appreciate this because I'm not sure if it's anachronism or if it's discomfort, right? And so it's a willful misleading because of the discomfort. Instead of, I mean, I do think I think calling it anachronistic is kinder, but
Okay.
but I don't think that actually is what's going on. And here's the thing, like, I know a lot of the people on the NRSV UE committee, for instance. Like, I know the people who did this, and I made comments, like about this particular thing, actually. And they're going to do what they're going to do, but are they trying to be malicious in misleading people? Or are it's really unpalatable to them because most of the people on those committees are people of faith, whether a Jewish tradition or Christian. And so it's uncomfortable for them to represent it in a raw kind of a way, right? It's uncomfortable. Well, what we mean by these relationships is this. So we're going to call it what we mean, because it's a sacred collection and it's really powerful. And so if we're going to present it as what it actually says, that's not going to go over well in the pews and in the synagogues, right? The people in the pews and the people in, it's really about that, in my opinion. And it's about things like power. And I mean, you know what I mean? Like, it's about, it's that, and it's not the level of intellectual integrity. It's the level of how this plays out for people of faith and what we want them to think about these ideas and passages. And I mean, it's really about the issue of faith and how that plays out for people.
Yeah.
And I like the people on the committee. Like, please, so that's why I raised the point. Like, they're lovely people, right? They're very intelligent people. They're some of the best in the field or whatever. But that doesn't mean that they're not seeing this clearly. Okay.
Well, would you say that this is a more of an instance of this ownership of women that we see in the Bible, like taking ownership of a woman rather than entering into some kind of like mutual relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that is what their moves are doing, is keeping us from seeing, yes, that's what's going on in the Hebrew Bible in particular. It still plays out some in the Newer Testament. Excuse me. But yes, in the Hebrew Bible, I think you're absolutely spot on there. The relationship that we call marriage is very much about women are property, right? Women are property, men own them, men get to control what, their bodies. And so anything that that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. Like that, most people don't want to acknowledge that, don't want to face that that's what's happening. And so, yeah, So that's part of the motivation for sure, to redirect on that. Mhm.
Hmm.
The relationship we call marriage in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the way it shows up is taking. Actually, in the chapter you are about to get to, so the one called it's a matter of terminology. They're actually the primary verb that's used in the Hebrew, lakach, to take, which is translated across the board when it has to do with a man and a woman, it is translated as marriage. It's not the only one, but it's the predominant one. But there are other verbs that are even worse.
Like worse, as far as like translate, like whenever they translate it to a more modern concept, like there's even worse violations of that.
No, not quite that way, but in the sense that, to me, the verbs themselves are actually they're being translated as marry, but the verbs in the original are even more aggressive about a man dominating over a woman.
Oh, okay. I'm
I
definitely
have to
interested in those.
Right. I mean, I kinda have to laugh at this even though it's not funny at all. Sorry,
I'm the exact same way, Dr.
right?
Bird. So
Thank you. Good. So you appreciate my ridiculous humor or whatever. So what, and
yeah.
just, I won't get into all of it, but one of the verbs is related to the noun for Baal, which many people are familiar with as a god, but used as a noun, it's just Lord, right? So
Mhm.
it's like asserting that he is going to be master over her. But that verb form is translated as marry. And then there's the verb nasa, which is to take by force. And I mean, I was looking at the scholarship on this, and these male biblical scholars were just doing all kinds of dancing around, like, well, this isn't bad or negative or what. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, it's the literal definition that people have agreed on, is that you take by force, like, meaning there's no bride price, there's no gift given, but literally just taken. So, financial exchange. Her father isn't given any money for it, right? And then there's another one that's even stronger in terms of
I
lording,
fe
like mastering over her. It's kind of gross. So the lakach is the most common verb form, but
Okay.
there are three or four others that are all more clear about men dominating women, and they're all being translated as to marry.
Yeah, I was gonna say that taking by force as a form of marriage, it sounds like a shotgun wedding, to be quite honest.
A
Sort of,
shotgun wedding? Yep, we
yeah.
could yeah. I mean, or you could look at all of the marriages that are like political alliances between countries, right? Taking by
Mhm,
force. I mean, this woman has no say at all, but she's a pawn between these men, right?
mhm.
Yeah, all kinds of but like one quick example of it is Mahlon and Chilion, the sons of Naomi and Elimelech in the story of Ruth, right?
Mhm.
So they all moved to Moab. These Hebrew people moved to Moab, and then the two sons take women, and it's nasa, but they marry women. It might say that they take some women as their wives or something like that, but it's nasaing. It's like take by force. It's like,
Mhm.
we just read right over it. We don't realize what's being said there.
Yeah. And so I'm guessing this passage, the Genesis 2:24, I guess this is primarily used like in apologetics now to say that, only a man and a woman are to be married, and that this is some kind of like, I guess, holy institution of God or something like
Yes,
that. Is that
God
right?
ordains marriage between a man and a woman, and no sex before marriage. It's used to say both, for
Mhm.
sure. But yes, definitely what you said. Definitely that God ordains marriage between a man and a woman.
Right. And I don't know if this comes up in the next verse, which is, I believe, Matthew 19, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Uh, but I know that you kind of made this distinction in the book about how um, what they're identifying as marriage is really just having sex. And so, like, that means that there can literally never be premarital sex, because any sex with a unclaimed woman is considered a marriage, right? So like there's no premarital sex in that sense, right?
Yes and no. It's such, again, you're like, you're hitting all the great points. It's
I've
in
read the book.
well, you have read the book, it's true. But the caveat on that is, like, both, yes, you're absolutely right, but then there's this other issue that unless the man doesn't actually want it to be a marriage. So, in other words, a man, biblically speaking, the way the narratives play out and what's being endorsed in the laws and all of the different things, a man claiming a woman as his own, the way he does it is to have sex with her. And that everybody knows she's his, right? He claims her as his own by having sex, and there you have it. There's no like, we don't know of any ceremony, blah blah blah. But there are cases when men have sex with women that they don't want to claim as their own, right? For whatever reason, and they don't have to. Right? Or so we look at the story of Jacob with his two sister brides, right? And Rachel and Leah, and the women who are given as a part of their wedding, or a part of their being paired up with him, he worked for them and then they're given to him. But they also have enslaved women who are, part of the package. Leah has her own, she's a servant, but usually translated as handmaid, or I don't know what, but Leah and Rachel both have a woman that come with them. So Jacob is having sex with 4 women, right? They all are under his roof, but he only has to claim 2 of them as his like, he's claimed 2 of them, taken 2 of them, had, only 2 of them count in what we would call a wife status, but the other 2 he's having sex with, and it's not a problem because it was a cultural practice. And it was important for creating the tribes of Israel. Like, I mean, in the narrative, it's essential. Nobody cares, but he's having sex with those other 2, Bilhah and Zilpah, and that's just that. Like, they're just there for sex.
Yeah, how I'm just wondering how if you have the same reaction that I do to that particular story, because like when I was a Christian, I never really read too critically in the Bible, right? But
Right.
once I started really studying like both the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament, this story really kind of, it made me laugh, but it like not because I think the situation's funny, but it's just like, how ridiculous is this situation? Because it's like Jacob, he works for 7 years to purchase a woman, and I always, whenever I bring up this story, I always make sure to like turn my head away. And when I'm talking to somebody, I yell purchase, because it's like, I want to drive that point home that he is purchasing a woman. And so he purchases a woman, but like I don't know what happened, but like, he marries the wrong woman. He's given the wrong woman, and he's like, "Oh no, I slept with the wrong woman. Why did you do this? I can't tell them apart." Like, that struck me as the weirdest story.
Right.
And so I don't know. It's kind of one of those situations where you laugh because it's really uncomfortable and not really good, but it's like, what are you trying to do, story? Like, this is the worst kind of story writing in my opinion.
Totally.
About
How
it.
is that even? Yeah. I do try to laugh about this. Don't tell me he didn't know it was Leah. Oh, who have I been with all night? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and then the narrative also continues and says, okay, he's angry, and the response, right? The response is, okay. Well, just give her 1 week with you, and at the end of the week, we'll give you the other one also. If you work for us for another 7 years. So like, he goes from nothing to all 4 women within a week. Like, it's just so many pieces of it are just wild. Right? Yeah.
All right. So, was there anything left to say about Genesis 2:24 before we move on to the Matthew 19 verse? Because the Matthew 19 verse, if I'm not mistaken, is the one that I kind of had a little bit of fun with on Facebook. Yeah.
Oh,
Well, I
nice.
like to make meme like, whenever I learn something new, and
Yeah.
I've been learning a lot from your book, whenever I learn something, I like to make a meme so that I can try to, like, do some edutainment basically
Yes. No,
on
I
it.
love it. I think it's great.
Yeah. And so that we're definitely gonna get to that one, but, is there anything left that you, wanna say about 224 here?
I you know, I there are things I could say, but I don't think so. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's the gist, the main thing that I'm interested in people taking, like, if there's a nugget, is that this isn't talking about marriage. We're importing marriage language onto it where it doesn't belong. And I think because of that, we're missing that what it's really getting at is this thing about humans and relationships, right? It's not good for the human to be alone. Let's get that human paired up. And when you're reading it from that perspective, then you can just you can just say, yeah, well, who are the people? Who is it I'm interested in being with? Instead of this is what God ordained for
Mhm.
all time, specifically. So
Right.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And if anybody wants way more information surrounding this, analyzing both of these verses from definitely a more granular sort of level, definitely get Dr. Bird's book here
mm,
because I mean it's fantastic. Like when I start reading it, I can't put it down. I'm just saying
so
like
nice
I'll
of you.
just keep reading it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh,
I will also say just really briefly, I do have the audio recorded, and I'm just waiting for the go ahead from the publisher to be able to release it. Yeah, yeah, 'cause I know
I'm
that
I'm
helps.
I'm u-
That
I'm
works for
definitely
me.
using one of my Audible credits for
Okay.
that too.
Sweet.
Uh, I'm always looking for good books to get, and that's definitely one I'm gonna wanna have in my library.
That's so
So,
nice of
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, so moving on to, the Newer Testament, which is Matthew 19. I can't remember the verse exactly.
Okay.
I know you know, but,
Yep.
which verse is it that we need to go to?
Yeah. Well, if you're gonna pull it up, I would look at Matthew 19:3 to 12. But the piece that people focus on is 4 to 6. So you
Yeah.
can yeah.
They
So
definitely like to cherry pick a lot out of
that's
the
right.
Bible in general.
Yes, but most people do, even when you're doing it for left-leaning purposes,
Yeah.
because you have to,
Well,
right? Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, whenever I bring up, things and people are like, "Oh, that's out of context," I'm like, "Well, let's read the context then." And so, like, I try to read like around it to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting it. So I
Right.
definitely value keeping things in context. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Um, so this passage, yes, when people quote, they quote verses 4 to 6. And which is interesting because verse 3 makes it opens up that they're not even talking about marriage specifically, they're talking about for which reason is Jesus okay with divorce. But this verse taken 4 to 6 taken out of context is used to say that divorce is not okay. So okay, so Pharisees come to him, they test him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" That is a shorthand way of getting at several couple hundred years of debate and like debates between amongst Jews about for which reason is it okay to divorce, right? So there's Hillel and Shammai, they're two groups in general. But so it's a shorthand way, and most people don't realize that. But anyway, he answers playing along with the way this debate has played out for several hundred years. Right? He says, have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning, quote, made them male and female, which is pulling from Genesis 1, and said from Genesis 2:24, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his woman, it should say, and the two shall become one flesh. So he's just quoted the two verses we just discussed, right? As
Mhm.
have all of the Jewish men before him. He's not doing something new here. He's just playing along. And then he follows up again in a way that was not new. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. End of discussion for people quoting this out of context. And so, then they said to him, why then did Moses command us to give him a certificate of dismissal? Blah, blah, blah. He said, it's because you were too hard hearted, yada, yada. But the beginning was not so. And here's a piece where I think I don't know for sure if this is new in terms of the conversation, but this to me ought to be included in defining marriage. biblical marriage because of what it says, which is what you were talking about earlier. This makes it very clear, verse 9, to me, but it took me a while to see it. So, and I say to you, whoever divorces his woman except for sexual immorality and marries another, there is a verb to marry in the Newer Testament, commits adultery. And he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So what this is showing us is that Jesus is agreeing with the Hebrew Bible way of talking about pairing up, which is that the only thing that's talked about when it comes to marriage is sex, having sex. The only thing that matters. We're never told, we don't give any stories about healthy relationships and communication and caring for each other. When it's talked about, it's a man goes into a woman. When they talk about marriage in the Newer Testament, it's only in light of sex. So this is part of the bigger conversation from my perspective. People are tend to be hung up on who is having sex together and therefore what kind of sex it's going to be. Is it able to be reproductive and so forth and so on? And in part, that's because the biblical texts set people up to only focus on the sexual intercourse, the intimacy part of it. And here, like I like to phrase, I know that you're a married man, right? I actually am not going to really put you on the spot, but sometimes I just ask people, so what are the top 5 things that define your marriage? Like, what is it that makes your marriage a marriage, And I'll playfully ask, or just say, well, I'm sure sex is probably in the top 5, but it's not the only thing, right? It isn't the thing that, and I didn't mean to say, like, maybe you two are asexual. I mean, it's possible, right? But, not terribly likely, but it's possible here. So the point here is he is focusing in on the reason you can't divorce is because you're going to have sex again. The reason you can't separate from this person is you will pair up again, and having sex with a second person or this other person is a cheating on this first person that you had sex with. And so the whole framework, the whole language around marriage and defining marriage is that, the sex act. No wonder so many people are hung up on that, can't get past that, or think that that needs to be the thing that defines who can get together.
Yeah, I guess where my brain kind of goes with this is, I guess this is, I guess generally people think, well, in the Hebrew Bible, they don't specify that men can only get married once or they can only have one wife. So it's kind of like, why is this even an issue? I guess maybe is where it goes to. But I guess this passage is really talking about the consequences of divorcing a woman, with the exception of the sexual immorality bit, and then continuing to have sex with other women, I guess. Yeah,
pair up again.
yeah.
The reason, yeah, exactly. The reason that divorce is not okay in this passage, according to Jesus, is that you're going to remarry. You're going to have sex with someone else. That's the reason the divorce is a problem, not what is very real to many people today. The heartache, the difficulty, the ripping families apart. You lose people, right? If you are a divorced couple, right? You lose friends and you lose family members you might have really enjoyed seeing at family gatherings, or how hard it can be on the children, or your own resources are now not pooled but are separate, and that is hard, right? That is hard. And all of those things, like, that's what makes divorce unfortunate. But that isn't on the table at all in this conversation. And so the fact that Jesus himself is saying, yeah, the reason divorce is a problem is you might have sex with someone else, like, that is what his Hebrew Bible has taught him to think about. And it is one of the more tragic verses in the Bible, in my opinion, because of this. Like, this verse 19:9 is really tragic because so many people just take it in and say, yep, I mean, Jesus said it, of all people, right? Divorce, you can't get divorced. I mean, that's the worst thing, like, no, let's look at why he thought, if we're going to posit that the guy Jesus actually said this, like, that's a whole other conversation, but
Yeah.
what was going on in the thinking here? It's still very much about men owning women's bodies, why, all these issues of pristineness around a woman and sex and all that. I mean, all of that's in the background, but focusing in on that, right? Focusing in on the sex part is the problem, right? That's just very unhealthy. I
Yeah.
just think it's wrong, and it's so harmful, over the centuries. It has just been terribly harmful.
Yeah, it kinda seems to reinforce this sexual objectification of women,
Totally,
right?
totally. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And
Absolutely. Go ahead. Yeah.
I feel like, looking at this, that, I can totally see how a lot of Christians would not even want to broach the whole topic of the fact that this only concerns men's ability to divorce a woman and not, like, a woman having the right to, like, divorce based on sexual immorality or anything like that.
Women were not allowed to initiate a divorce. Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, well said. I mean, right? It's all of
Yeah.
it. It's about what a man can and cannot do with a woman.
It's
Yeah,
just it's really weird because, you have a lot of people now that, put Jesus up on a pedestal,
of
and I'm
course.
not saying that he doesn't have, like, good qualities that he teaches, but, it seems rather weird to put somebody up on a pedestal that's like, "Oh, yeah, women don't," or at least to the point of not discussing the ability of women to have any kind of say in their
Right,
marital, relationships. It seems
right.
kinda weird, right?
I Yes, I wanna just let that sit for a second. I'm like, "Yes, it does." And it's hard for people in Christian communities to be able to see this, right? It's really hard because that pokes a hole in something really important for them, and I get that, but that's why, like, I struggled with, to a certain degree, some of the things I put in this book. I almost, like, 5 years ago, I'm not sure I would have put in there. But but that's why I decided I needed to, right?
Mhm.
Because people don't want to see these things about Jesus in particular. Here, he's suggesting that he's kind of reinforcing this women are objects, right? But also, and this was, I will never forget this. I was having a conversation by Zoom like many years ago, pre-pandemic, before it was a big thing, and I remember having this conversation with a very conservative fundamentalist evangelical, and I said something about Matthew 19. I said, "Well, what about Jesus's comments about eunuchs at the end of that exchange?" And he physically shook, and he just changed the conversation, changed the subject, and I was like, "No, but here's the thing, John," and I was saying it to him at the time, "but here's the thing. This is all still set up. We haven't gotten to the point that the writer of Matthew is trying to make here. So
Mhm.
this is all just preliminary stuff, and it's verses 10 to 12 that I think are really juicy." And
Those verses are the ones I made the meme about, but
good. Oh, good. I'll have to go
sorry.
look it up. I wanna see what you did. Yeah, so, when it's the disciples react like, "Oh my gosh, if that's the case, it's better for us not to marry to begin with," and he's kinda like, "Yeah, probably." He doesn't challenge that. He just keeps moving. He's like, "Yeah, not everyone can handle this teaching, but only those to whom it's given. There are eunuchs who've been so from birth. There are eunuchs who've been made that by others, and there are eunuchs who've made themselves for the sake of the kingdom. Let anyone accept this who can." I mean, that is the exact opposite of being fruitful and multiplying. Right?
Yep.
So we're quoting out of context, "Be fruitful, multiply" up here in 4 to 6, but the point that Jesus is making is it's pretty radical. It is non-hetero, and it is non-reproductive, because eunuchs were known, not whether or not it's true, they had a reputation for being adept at sexual encounters with men and women, and they are not reproducing. I mean, that undermines traditional family values as defined in this country, right?
Yeah, I sorry for interrupting, but
No,
I
no, go,
remember,
go.
I remember, this section because I read it and really and it was like I just dawned on me, like, what this actually means, this section. But I like, you put in there, like, the proclivity of eunuchs for being, very sexual in nature. Uh, but the one thing that made me chuckle was you were talking about, I can't remember the girl's name in the Hebrew Bible. The one where the eunuchs went out and procured like all the young girls for the king.
Book of
I want to
Esther.
say
Yeah.
Esther.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, the eunuch that was taking care of Esther, like, knew how to please the king, like knew how to be the chosen one. And it's like, how did he know that?
Isn't that great? Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a friend point that out to me at Peterson Toscano, and I was like, "Oh my."
That you
Whichever
don't
way
get
you get
you
yeah.
yeah, you don't get taught that in Sunday school. I just know that.
That part isn't read very closely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as far as the eunuchs, I know
Yeah.
that you talk about, like, the what it means to be a eunuch at this time, and I'm just
Mhm.
kind of wondering if you can explain that a little bit, because Jesus seems to be like in favor, of the whole being a eunuch,
Yeah,
or what it means to be a eunuch in this situation.
exactly. I am I'm also I was just gonna pop into the chat, I don't know which if I put it in here, does it show up in both streams? I'm not quite sure.
Uh, it should, if you're logged in over here. Yeah, well, it's on yours, but I can definitely put it in mine.
Okay, okay. I mean, that would be great. Um, the reason I'm sharing that is on that website, I have linked the article that I draw from in this part of the chapter because it's really meaty. I mean, it's biblical scholarship, traditional biblical scholarship, which tends to be very, dense. And so the essence, like what it boils down to for me in terms of trying to apply it in this context is within the first century context, there's already, I mean, eunuchs have been around. It's not like it's a new thing. Um, and the reputation associated with them is around gender. So they were often talked about as like either, and this is the way they're talked about. I don't think of it this way, but as some sort of abnormality or something grotesque, or even the language of a third gender was used, so that they were both male and female, and therefore neither or something other, right? So I find that interesting that Jesus is being affirming of of bodies that are non-binary by definition or by perception, right? Um, so there's that piece historically. There's also what we were just joking about, which is, you know, when people often say, "Well, once a man is castrated, he can't have sex." I'm like, "Well, that's interesting. 2 things. 1, if they're castrated post puberty, they can sometimes still get an erection. But 2, you were assuming that sex is only about sticking it in something."
That they have a very limited view of sex in that case, yes.
Right? And it's actually kind of tragic. Yeah.
Mhm.
So those are and so he points out and he points to all these different, in Greek and Roman stories and philosophers and writers and all this, so it's not this is it's a well researched, point that he's making here, that castrated men, right, eunuchs were good adept at pleasing both men and women. And there are women, wealthy women over the centuries sometimes preferred, a eunuch as their lover because it was, child prevention, childbirth,
Mhm.
good. What am I trying to say? Good. Um, so
Like contraceptive.
thank you. I was like, what am I trying to say here? Yes, it's a good, yeah, prophylactic. Anyway, it's complicated because there are also people who are associated with specific different religious temples or cults or, traditions whose priests would be specifically, castrated, and that would be part of their role is, or part, if you're going to be a priest for so and so, that's that's part of what goes on. And so people are saying, some people have pushed back on what I'm presenting here, saying, well, isn't he really just kind of saying something about over here and the priests and things? And I'm like, you know what? All of those things are true. All of the things and that particular religious tradition in particular in that region is mentioned in the article. If people want to go look that up, and there are resources you can turn to find the writings about them. But from my perspective, what I think is really helpful for us is to look at what is being endorsed by Jesus. So for people for whom it matters what Jesus says, like, yeah, in verse 9, he just reinforced that women are property. And in verse 12, he affirms a non-binary person who can't reproduce. Like, we've got a lot of messages going on here in the biblical texts, but within a span of 10 or 12 verses, we've just gone from endorsing being fruitful. Well, actually, that's not even referenced specifically here, right? But we have the same passage is talking about being fruitful and multiplying. And then we've also endorsed people who absolutely cannot. That's a pretty striking set of realities in terms of biblical messages about what is okay or expected or whatever, validated by God. I mean, for people for whom Jesus is God, God is endorsing non-binary humans who have non-hetero sex.
Yeah.
It's just a thing. And the history of the church turns this reference to eunuchs into being celibate, which is deeply ironic. But it's partly because so many men in the early church were taking this very seriously and were castrating themselves. And so the very first council of kind of church leaders in the Mediterranean area, happened in the year 325 Common Era, and was the emperor Constantine is the one who said, you guys need to get your shit together. So like, you arguing over these theological ideas is going to split my empire. So could you get together and make some decisions about some things? It's called the Nicene Council. But the very first proclamation that they made at that meeting was, if you have castrated yourself, you are not allowed to be a leader in the church. That's how common and how problematic the practice became. So subsequent to that council, church leaders started rereading this passage about eunuchs as being about being celibate, not having sex. People who choose to not have sex, which is just funny. But most people today read this thing about eunuchs and think, oh, they're celibate. They're not, because eunuchs can't have sex. Eunuchs are, well, that's not true, actually. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing to me, passage.
Yeah, it seems like if Jesus wanted to focus on being celibate, then he would just focus on that, right? Like, he would just say that. I mean, It's not like they didn't have a word for celibacy, and he didn't have to necessarily dress it up with some kind of like poetic language here. He could have just been like, that those that don't have sex are better off.
Right.
Like that, right?
Yes. The people who want to be priests in my community just are not having sex. Yes, they can just say it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do have the meme that I made.
Oh, good.
That
Good.
was inspired. And okay. Let's see. So it says, "Hey dudes, if you're serious about getting into heaven, you'll do a DIY nut removal, or let your bro do it. Just don't show up with your jewels, okay?"
Yes, I love it. Matthew 19:12. I mean, that's great. I can't remember if I put it in the book or not, but when I first started thinking about this, I'm like, yeah, I've actually thrown this out at people who are bugging me, like on Twitter or whatever. I'm like, so when are you and your brother, when are you and your buddies going to castrate yourself? Yeah, just do that. and also, can you just imagine a Matthew 19 booth at Promise Keepers?
Come on, bros.
Right.
You want to get into heaven? This is the fast track right here.
We are serious devote. Yeah, we are serious disciples.
Oh man. All right. So I find that this is rather intriguing, considering all the rhetoric that's usually thrown around about traditional marriage in the, as ordained by God or whatnot, because it definitely, if you believe that Jesus is God in some kind of way, and he's over here seeming to, affirm not only a non-binary type of gender, as well
Mhm.
as non-heterosexual relationships or non-heterosexual unions or whatever. It seems to be very counter to their general line about it. So it seems like this could be like, like, I feel secure in if somebody comes up and be like, well, God doesn't like gays, and it's like, okay, and or them saying that trans people don't exist. It's like, oh, well, I mean, Jesus seems to be perfectly fine with non-binary or people that don't exactly match the normal gender, norms or whatnot, and also seems to be perfectly fine with heteronormative relationships. So, I mean, I don't know what you're talking about.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, exactly. It feels to me like the linchpin, you know?
Yeah.
This verse. It could, if people just took it more seriously. I created a couple short videos trying to highlight this, like, this is why I care about Matthew 19:12, because it's words in Jesus' mouth, and what Jesus says is really powerful for a lot of people. And goodness, this is a game changer, but so many people have other things associated with it. They can't hear that, or they just want, whatever. Same kind of
Yeah.
pushback that you were talking about you have when you point out something in about like Mary or whatever, and people push back because
Yeah.
it's too far, too much.
Was there anything that we didn't get a chance to cover concerning this particular passage?
I don't think so. And I think yeah, here's the well, if we've already kind of stated this, but here's one of the quotes is eunuchs were universally characterized by the frequency, ease, and adeptness with which they performed sex acts with both men and women.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's the but yeah,
Yeah.
both the eunuch piece, which is really powerful and important, and people in trans communities today tend to appreciate what's going on for eunuchs in terms of there's something changing about their bodies, whether it's done intentionally by them or has been done to them. I mean, it's a different scenario for sure. But I know that um, I've had many trans people reach out to me and talk about this, that for them eunuchs are really important. Anyway, so I find it interesting and I try to listen and learn from that. But also, I mean, I'm kind of seeming hypocritical. I just wanna acknowledge that, right? Because I'm highlighting verse 12 because I like what it's saying, because what it's pointing out, and I'm not thrilled with verse 9, and I'm pointing that out, right? So
Mhm.
that I realize what I'm doing, right? I realize that I'm saying this is nasty, but it's put in Jesus' mouth, and so let's pay attention to that. And by the way, this is great, and it's put in Jesus' like this is the nature of these texts, right? Is
Mhm.
there's a lot of contradiction, there are a lot of ancient ideas, yada yada, and then there's these surprising things that happen, and then there's this, and so it's anyway. I just wanted to acknowledge that because I know that's something that people
Yeah.
sometimes feel like, wait,
No, I understand that, but I kind of feel, I guess the way that I take it is just highlighting how our understanding of these texts has been manipulated and changed
Mhm,
from what it
mhm,
truly means. Because it's
mhm.
like, nowadays, people aren't going to know like how adept eunuchs were at switching, their sex partners and everything, and that Jesus was speaking favorably. Like Jesus didn't take offense to being called a eunuch. I mean,
Exactly.
I
Yes.
feel like it's very much akin to like if anybody calls me like gay or slur for gay or whatnot, I'm like, so what if I am? Like
Mhm,
that's kind of the energy that kind of brings. But I also think that it's important to highlight how the problematic nature of like verse 9. Like, I mean, Jesus having complicated, nuanced positions on things, whether some are good or some are bad, just seems to be like a normal thing, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I know that we have the Ephesians to get through. Did you want to cover that one too?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Ephesians feels to me like it's kind of the bane of my scholarly existence because I've been asked to write like a couple different commentaries on it, very short ones, not full, not full, and it just drives me crazy, this passage. So I decided. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, what were the verses? I'm currently in the middle of reading the Ephesians chapter. So.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's Ephesians 5, and the verses are 31 and 32, but we do, I don't know how much of the context you want to look at.
Oh, just whatever you want to bring up.
Okay.
Context is important.
It is. So let's do verses 21 to 33.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so funny the way they have that separated. Verse 21 is separated from verse 22. Whole deliberation, in scholarly material about that. Like, is it a wrap up of the previous verses? Is it a lead into the next? I think it's actually both. But yeah. So the verses that are quoted, right, the reference to biblical marriage are verses 31 and 2. So again, just skipping down to that for this reason. So this is a paraphrase of one we've already talked about, right? Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his woman. There is no word for wife in Greek, and the two will become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I am speaking about Christ and the church. And that's where we stop, which is hilarious since the very next verse says, each of you, referring to men, should love his woman as himself, and a woman should fear her man.
Wow.
Exactly.
Yeah, I know it renders it as respect here, but it's got a caveat. Wait, how ridiculous is this? Look, it says should respect her husband with a caveat. Come down here, it says or fear. Like it's just an aside, like respect or fear, whichever one strikes your fancy.
Yes, it's phobos. It's the word we use to attach to words like a fear of spiders, right? Arachnophobia. It's a fear. And it's that's a whole nother conversation, right? When it says to fear the Lord, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, blah, blah, blah. Does that mean respect or does that mean fear? And I think it's both. And it's anyway, so yes. But it's also troubling to me because again, I am kind of going on a tangent, but the other passages that are in the Newer Testament that are language directed at women in terms of their relationship with their men are couched in fear language. And it's at times in First Peter, I wrote my dissertation on First Peter 3, the first 6 verses. And the language there is, it's saying you've become a daughter of Sarah if you do what is good and are not frightened by terrifying things. Like it's just it's just fear. Like this language is pervades. So anyway, so no wonder people stop at verse 32. They don't quote 33. And that's just, it's so disingenuous, right? When it's very clear you're focusing on this one piece, but in context, we've got a very different thing happening. So when I talk about this in the book, I'm focused just on verse 32 since that's the new content. And what is really interesting to me is what this verse, this is a great mystery. I'm speaking about Christ and the church. What this verse has done and been kind of foundational for the church. And it becomes foundation for sacramental language for people in the church. And that might not mean anything to a lot of people, but it's this verse. This is a really powerful verse in terms of what it is holding up within Christian tradition and belief and all that. So so I like to talk about the whole passage because it starts out, that's interesting. Oh yeah, the footnote there on verse 22, wives also. Okay, that's not okay. I'm a little thrown by that. I want to go look it up, but I'm not going to right now. But anyway, wives, be subject to your men. So it's actually in the Greek. It's actually saying women, be subject. Submit yourself to your men as to the Lord. For the man is the head of the woman, just as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its savior. Just as the church is subject to Christ, so also women ought to be in everything to their men. And I've actually had an exchange with a female pastor who insisted that this passage, verses 22 to 33, is egalitarian. Meaning Yeah, she thinks that this is this is the basis for men and women being equals in a marriage. I'm like, I don't know how you can even say that. Like verse 23 says that, or just 24, right? Women are subject to their men the way the church is subject to Christ. I mean, that's a pretty clear hierarchy there. Like that's not equals, right? Well,
Mhm.
but then it turns around and says, "Men, love your women." Okay, that's true. And that was somewhat progressive at the time to suggest that a man would actually love his woman instead of just his lover on the side. Um, and love your woman is progressive at the time, but it's also being placed in this context of the woman is to fear you. And so this isn't equality. It's people wanting it to be that and ignoring what's actually being said here. So, and honestly, and I usually try to point this out, I think that the standard being placed for men is also unfair. When it says that men love your women as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her in order to make her holy by cleansing her with the washing of the water, blah blah blah, as to present the church to himself in splendor. This is problematic for me. All of this is without a spot or wrinkle or anything of the kind, right? Because the woman, the bride, has to be pure, blah blah blah. It's really gross, right? Perpetuating the purity standards for women, all of that. In the same way, men should love their women as their own bodies. He who loves his woman loves himself. No one ever hates his own flesh. Well, we've just established that men are to emulate Christ. And according to traditions, Christ died, but he was raised from the dead. If a man dies for his woman, he's not coming back from the dead. And I have people, men in the, community, in the audience or whatever, push back and say, I like having that standard to live up to. I'm like, okay, that feels to me a little bit like Stockholm syndrome, and I don't say that out loud, but I do think that, like, okay, that is important to you. You've been given a positive example for you, and that works for you, and I respect that, but it also concerns me personally because it's not a fair standard. It also, ramps up what this idea that men have to be the breadwinner, all of that is playing out in this context, in this passage. Anyway, so no one ever hates his own flesh, blah, 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 because we are members of his body. No one ever hates his own flesh, but he nourishes and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the church, because we're members of his body. Okay. So for me, this passage, then you get to this for this reason, right? A man leaves his parents, joined to this woman. This is a great mystery. So the short take home on this passage very much endorses hetero only marriage, right? The Christ to the church, a male to a bride. And when you have that language, I'm speaking about Christ and the church. Christ didn't actually marry the church, but Christ is the head of the church. We have a lot of mixed metaphors going on here. So it's really powerful language that it's troubling to me in general, but you have all of the pieces of women needing to be pure and holy and white and clean, and men, it doesn't even matter. And that's perpetuated here, and doesn't sit well with me. Women are being told to be subservient to their man as they are to the Lord. This is a dynamic that I think a lot of men typically brush aside because, well, I'm supposed to love her, and that's a good thing, right? It is a good thing to love your partner. Anyway. The overall context here is still very hierarchical. It's not equality. And then you have this issue about the mystery, and there's a lot to say there. What do you want to talk about this passage?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, I was just gonna say that, yeah, when I've encountered, when having these discussions out in the wild, uh, typically they do represent this as an egalitarian sort of view of relationships in the Bible, and presenting it that way, which, I mean, honestly, I hadn't thought to look at the caveat about, respect. or fear, kind of thing down there, which I'm gonna definitely be pointing out in the future. But it's like, in this section, a lot of times people will say stuff like, "Oh, well, it says that you should love your wife," and it's like, yeah, it does, but that still doesn't detract from the fact that you've got this hierarchical,
Right.
sort of pattern to it where
Mhm.
the women are subservient to the men. Like that's
Mhm.
just a a plain reading of it. And typically people get mad when I, read from the Bible. Like they don't like
Plain
it when I
reading.
just read yeah, just
You point out what's there that they
read.
didn't
Yeah.
want to do. Uh-oh. Looks like I'm frozen. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened with my camera. There we go. Weird. Should I just keep talking until it comes back, or should I hop
Sh
out maybe and hop back in? I don't know.
if you want to. It sounded like your mic changed a little bit.
There
So I
we
don't know
go.
what. Oh, wait, there you are.
Yeah, let's do really quickly check it. So it's still my microphone's set, so I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, you're sounding fine
Yes.
now. You're back.
Okay. Okay. The other thing, this is an important thing to point out, which I'm not sure I've included this in the chapter, which is when we see men love your women, we think of our modern concept of love. But love in their context wasn't about emotions. It was about caring for. It was a it was a commitment, not a emotion, not a I'm in love with you, that kind of a thing. There was, masters had love for their enslaved people. They took care of them, or like they use the word this idea about loving very differently than we do. And Jennifer Kunst has written an article about that. But I think that's not something I bring up in the book, but it's even that, right? Even this thing that we like to say, "Oh, well, look, the men are being told to love." Like, yeah, even that is not what you think it is.
I do remember you, I think briefly mentioning that because I do remember you mentioning Jennifer
Oh, okay.
and the aspect of that this kind of love that's being discussed is not like how we think of like love or what it
Oh, good.
means for like me to love my wife or something like that. It was very much in a different light. It was a section that I just read, so
Oh,
I don't remember it exactly,
yeah.
but
I'm
yeah,
glad
you
it
definitely said something about that.
Yeah, yeah. The good. I'm glad to know that I did get that in there because I was just sitting here thinking, I don't normally talk about that part, but the other thing about this to me is this mystery part, and, there's a there's actually a great deal going on from my perspective in this passage, and partly because of the way the early church fathers started taking it and using it. And what I wanted in when I was researching for this book, I really didn't wanna engage Augustine, um,
Mhm.
be though a lot of people, especially in Catholic traditions, but everybody, any Christian today is influenced by Augustine's thoughts, whether they're aware of it or not. And I really didn't want to engage him because I find him so difficult and really unappealing, deeply difficult and antagonistic and nasty and ugly and all kinds of horrific things about reading him. Like it's really hard for me. But when I got to this chapter, I realized I really had to engage Augustine and some of his writings. And because of how influential they've been for people in church. So I ended up we decided to call it a postscript on Augustine. Um, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because his ideas about sex and marriage are still alive and well today. Like we see it in people's we see it playing out, even though people don't know that those ideas and beliefs come from Augustine. So, for people who've been taught, no sex outside of marriage or before marriage, no sex before marriage in particular, and the way that procreation is managed and is only for marriage in people's minds, that comes from Augustine. That really is solidified by him. So the postscript I engage primarily just one of his writings, although I read through multiple sections. But he wrote a piece called "On the Good of Marriage," meaning the thing that comes from marriage that is a good thing. And it's really fascinating because he was at the time he was trying to encourage some Christians to be okay with marriage at all. Which is hilarious in some way, like, because there were groups of people who were anyway, it's all very complex. So he's having to, like, actually convince people that marriage is it's okay to marry, and it's okay to have sex. And, like, that tells you about, like, how diverse some of these communities were. And so he's saying over again that what makes sex okay is that you're having it in a marriage, and children can come from it. And that's what makes the sinfulness of sex. He says this directly, right? The sinfulness of sex is okay because it's because and like it all and over, and it's just all this awful things about coupling up. And anyway, so it's one of the more important contributions of the book, but because it's not specifically about marriage in the Bible, I couldn't put it in the main part of the book. So I'm not sure that how many people are actually going to read it. So anyway, when we talk about Paul and his rhetoric, I like to talk about how harmful some of his rhetoric is and can be, and people are taught to read right over it and to not notice it, but then they're still impacted by it. That's the same thing here with Augustine, and he helped define a really significant portion of church ideas. So anyway.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how far back, like, a lot of these doctrines sort of trace. It makes it seem like a lot of the, I guess, modern understandings of things in Scripture are just, new representations of old ideas
That's right.
that have been set forth,
Yeah.
by
Yep.
those people.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's crazy to think of sex as being redeemed by the fact that you have children or can have children. Like,
Yeah.
that entire concept is rather weird. I was gonna ask you though, on this section where it says this is a great mystery.
Mhm.
Um, one of the things that I know that I'm really interested in is how Christianity sort of connects to these mystery religions that were around at the time in the Mediterranean. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering if could this at all be like a reference to, like, how mystery cults and everything like that sort of structured their beliefs,
Mm.
or is it something different entirely?
Um, Another great question. I did actually decide. Let me see. I'm trying to turn to it here. I put in. It's called Appendix B. It's page 195 in the hard copy. I pulled together. So I'm going to indirectly answer your question. I pulled together other references in the book of Ephesians to the word mysterion. So the Greek there for mystery is mysterion. And I also I don't quote them, but I list all the other references in the Pauline letters to this term mysterion. And so you could go look them up and see how it's being used in the Pauline mind, which is more than one person. But anyway, um, the thing is, aside from here, the way it's being used here in Ephesians 5:32 is different than any of the other Newer Testament references. And therefore, gosh, I'm sorry about my camera. I'm not sure what's going on with my connection. But I'll keep talking. But
Yeah.
in other passages of Ephesians, the mystery that they're talking about there is the mystery of this thing that God is doing. So, for instance, Ephesians 1, verses 3 to 10. I won't read the whole thing, but blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing, blah, blah, blah. He destined us for adoption. With all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure that he set forth in Christ. Um, so in chapter 3, you perceive my understanding of the mystery of Christ, or God's grace that was given to me, and how the mystery was made known to me by revelation. So to answer your question, it is similar, right? It is similar to these mystery cults where you have special knowledge, right? I mean, that's part of what's going on. You don't know everything that's going on in these cults. You have to be initiated into them in order to, get the goods. But it's also, I don't, yeah, let me just leave it at that and see what your response is. What's your follow-up on
No,
that?
yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Like, there's a lot of like mystery cult language and a lot of indications from Paul's letters of sort of a mystery cult structure to at least what how he understood Christianity and the Christian religion. And so I know I can't remember if Ephesians is one of the authentic.
It is
Uh,
not.
okay,
Colossians and
no,
Ephesians are not, and that's where you get a
okay,
lot of that particular kind of mystery, spiritual being mystery,
hmm
kind of spirituality, mystery. Yeah. I mean, what did Paul think? We could look at one of the genuine Paul if you wanted to, as a way to look at that. I don't know. Romans chapter 11, verse 24 to 26, maybe. So it's specifically in verse 25, but I want you to understand this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not claim to be wiser than you are. Hardening has come upon part of Israel until the Gentiles. So this mystery of being grafted in, it's a little bit, to me, in the genuine Paul, it doesn't sound like it does in Ephesians and Colossians, for instance. To me, it sounds more and like, yeah, it's kind of a mystery. We could look at another passage too, though, like if you wanted to follow up with that, just to kind of,
oh, sure.
yeah. So Romans 16 verses 25 to 27, which is interesting because not all ancient manuscripts include these verses.
Okay.
Yeah. So now to God who is able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the proclamation of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages. That does sound a little bit more like what you're talking, mystery cult stuff, but is now disclosed and through the prophetic writings is made known to all Gentiles. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I mean, that's a little bit of both, in my opinion, right? A little bit of
Yeah.
mystery cultish, a little special knowledge. A little bit
Yeah,
not.
and I guess I was just trying to get your take on that
Yeah.
Ephesians, like the
Yeah.
mystery, because I know that there's some kind of like mystery around the use of it there, and like what it could mean that this is a great mystery and everything. So I guess
Gotcha.
I was unsure if it really connected to the mystery cult type
I
stuff.
don't think it does, to be honest. That's my
Okay.
take, and I am open to reconsidering that for sure. I'm open to reconsidering any of the things that I have thought because every time I've reconsidered something big, it's like, oh shoot, yeah, and it's also weird when I encounter other who haven't considered some of these things. I'm like, oh no, oh I can't believe you haven't thought about that yet. So I am open to it. Um, it also isn't a big deal to me. Like, it's not the thing I'm
Right.
interested. You know what I mean? But yeah. So I think that's a
No,
fun
I
thing. I
totally
mean, yeah, it's an
yeah.
interesting thing to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's totally not the focus for me. I
Yeah.
suspect that I'm a bit ADHD, and so like when I see that, my brain goes off and is like, "Whoa, mystery!" Like
Yeah.
because there's all this other mystery talk and everything, and I'm wondering how that. So my brain goes
Understood.
off, on
Yeah.
tangents too.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked. Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're at about an hour and a half now, and so we're
Uh-huh.
coming up on our time.
Okay.
But I was there were a few topics that I kind of wanted to get your input about, which we've kind of talked in the pre-interview sort of messages and everything. But I kind of wanted to talk about it here because I've very much been focusing on a number of topics, just on my social media presence in general, and that's
Mhm,
mainly
mhm,
challenging these ideas that
mhm,
a lot of people have about certain aspects of the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament. And so the first that I wanted to bring up
mhm.
that I normally bring up is child marriage, um, because recently, do you know who Eric Hovind is?
I've heard of, and I do not know anything specific.
Okay. So Eric, he runs Creation Today. He makes a lot of inflammatory posts like on different social media stuff. And he had this whole conversation about equating um, the LGBTQIA plus community to minor attracted individuals, trying not to get like flagged by YouTube
Yep,
or
understood. Understood.
pedophiles.
Yep, yep,
Yeah.
yep, yep. I understand what you're doing.
Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, and so he was saying that like, well, there's just as much consent in these minor attracted people's relationships as there is in LGBTQIA
What?
plus
What?
relationships.
What?
Yeah, and then he posted up a video of like a Muslim man who was had already become engaged to an 8-year-old child.
Oh
And
god.
he's saying that there's just as much consent
Oh
here
god.
as there are in these other situations. But getting around to my point,
Yeah.
I made the argument that basically Kent or Eric can't actually use the Bible as a standard for for saying that child marriage is immoral.
That's right.
Um, and I actually got with Dr. Josh Bowen.
Oh, good.
I think,
Yeah,
yeah, I got with him. He gave me great references
good.
as far as like the scholarship on it, and it
Yep.
definitely seems like the situation that was in the video is actually like biblically approved, where the a man around age of like 24 or between the ages of like 18 and 24 or so was engaged to be married to an 8-year-old child. If a father had already sold off his daughter like prior to puberty, then the daughter couldn't refuse or something like that. And so like there was this whole long section just basically laying out that yes, the Hebrews and the Israelites engaged in child marriage because that was the norm at the time, and this was like a
Right,
normal practice in the ancient Near East. And
right.
so I guess my question for you is on your view of the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament, is there any way to use that to say that child marriage is immoral or is bad or not, like Jesus or God would say that's not a good thing?
I don't know of any passage, so I'm not up on all of the context that, Dr. Josh is and all of the background content because 'cause I'm not familiar with any biblical passages that make it very clear that men are taking young women, like girls, but I know that it was like, I know that that was part of the deal, like, right?
Mhm.
What so I'm trying to be honest about what I know and versus what I've heard, and even sometimes some of the scholarship I've read isn't even accurate, so I'm trying to be clear about those distinctions here. So, in general, the idea of a young female being pledged to a man would happen at when she started to get her period,
Mhm.
and that is quite young. That is the whether or not her body is prepared now to potentially produce a child does not mean that she isn't also still a child. So 12, 11, 12, 13. I don't know. You tell me, John. Is that a child bride if she's then married off at age 13?
I
To
mean,
me?
I typically consider, those ages to be like child, like I would refer to that as like I have a 14-year-old son.
Okay.
He's still a child.
Thank you. That's helpful. That's very
Yeah.
helpful, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we see happening, or that's part of what is happening at least. So a child bride is is not being condemned. That is not a practice that's condemned by the Newer Testament. And in fact, when you look at the story that is created, 2nd century to endorse this idea of Mary having been, um, needing to endorse Mary as special enough to give birth to Jesus, who ends up being called God, right? There are traditions that are created to support that, and I feel like something is wrong with my computer. I am so sorry. I don't know what to do to to fix it, especially since we're near the end here. Um, yeah, the story is makes it very clear that when she was born, she was handed over to a temple, and as soon as she got her period is when Joseph took her home, right? So, that's a child bride right there. I don't
Yeah.
care, right? Um, this kind of stuff really starts to, make me very, very, upset because because it is still happening today. Men are still taking in certain parts of the world, right? Men are still taking, uh, children as their children to be sex slaves, basically, and it's
Mhm.
deeply disturbing, right?
Well,
But it
yeah, so part oh, sorry, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say in, my video, I made a point to connect both the Newer Testament and what's currently happening, and I did that by stating that, it's really only relatively recently that, most of the child bride laws in America have been, done away with, like, I'm talking between 2018 and 2020, the only pushback that they got were from conservatives, who wanted to still maintain the ability to marry children.
It's just so
And
gross.
yeah, I even made the connection there, because like one in Eric's state, Florida, they specifically said that, well, you can marry a 17-year-old, as long as they had, the approval of a judge, but also the girl had to be pregnant. And so it's like, this sounds a lot like a certain biblical law. Let's read it. And so, like, I basically pointed to in, I can't remember where, I think it's in Deuteronomy where it's like, if you, uh, um, if you sexually assault, a girl and, you're caught or whatever, you have to pay,
Mhm,
the father for the damages or whatever. So, like,
mhm,
you've got to marry her
mhm,
essentially
mhm.
and keep her, and you can't divorce her and all this other
Right.
stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's like both of these things are very creepy, but also they seem connected to me.
Oh,
Like it,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think you are
Um,
absolutely right. Yep.
yeah.
Mhm.
This kind of brings me back to something I had in my show notes here.
Yeah.
Um, that maybe you could talk about consent we've kind of been talking about
Mm,
consent, but I guess
yeah.
maybe just to more explicitly talk about it.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't see women ever having any kind of consent considered
No,
in the Bible at all.
that's correct. I mean, pure and simple, that is correct. What we do see, for instance, we see that Michal is interested in David. And so she's happy about being paired up with him, being given to him, but that doesn't mean that's not the same thing, right? Like, she's interested, and so she's given to him, and that's a positive for her. But that's not the same thing as saying these 2 people decide to get married. And then the issue of consent, which I think you're asking about consent in an intimate moment, not just consent to marrying, or which are you asking about, actually?
Well, I guess both, like, consent
Mm.
in intimate moments, but also consent in, what we would consider marriage, or what they are talking about as far as marriage.
Yeah, yeah, so yeah, so there are too many examples where the marriage thing is an exchange between the 2 men involved, the father of the woman and then the man who wants to take her, right? To
I'm so
Go ahead.
sorry, one second.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard of that, that's my wife,
Oh, yeah.
shit,
Everything okay?
oh, yeah, everything's fine, she's on the road right now, she's, traveling with her mom,
Huh.
and they just went to the Shawshank prison,
Oh, wow.
uh, up there in, I don't know where it's located at, but it's up there near New York, I think.
Okay. Okay.
So yeah, they were
Well,
on there and they were she was just calling me, I guess, to talk, but,
talk about that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. But
Lot to talk about.
yeah, so anyways, we were talking
Mhm.
about consent,
Mhm. Right.
consent in marriage,
Yeah.
consent in, intimacy.
Intimacy. Yeah. So, yeah, the bottom line is no, there isn't, when you see, what we call marriage, so a pairing up, a man taking a woman, that's what it is. There's no space for consent there, right? We see very explicitly that when when the slave person to Abraham goes off to find a partner for Isaac, right? He has all these gifts and he's buying this woman and she's excited that she's going to get away from the family now, but the whole conversation takes place between the two men. She's not even involved. The fact that she happens to be okay with it is part of the picture, and I'm not trying to ignore that, right? But she didn't have an alternative, right? What are her choices? Like, to resist? That doesn't go well. Also, who's writing the stories, right? So we're getting all of these things from men's perspectives. These are stories by men and for men. So of course, so why do we even need to talk about the women, right? So there isn't any example where a female says, this is what I want in the biblical, either testament. But more importantly is this issue about intimacy, and I try not to use language that is going to flag, what you've got going on here. So, but I think that the way that it is talked about, right, the over and over, the narrative will say a man goes into a woman. Like, it's just so literal and weird, and it's all about what a man does to a woman. And this is supported by what we see happening elsewhere, where men talk about this sex, act, as something that a man does to a woman. The male is active, the female is passive. That is how this act is talked about in lots of places in the ancient world. So that even what we think of, I hope for most people's sake, as something that's mutually done and enjoyed and that both partners are active in, right? That isn't what they're talking about. They're not talking about that. They're talking about a man getting off into a woman. Like, and it's very proactive. Like, it's just kind of a thing. It's not, and I don't also, but hear me, I don't think that that's how everybody was doing it. That's how it's talked about. That's the only way it's talked about. And this goes into gender roles in terms of, what it means to be a man is to be strong and virile and dominate a woman. And that includes physically as well as sexually, right? So, and a woman is feminine and passive and receptive, and she just takes it, so in the marriage bed. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so this idea of consent, yeah, I love it, right? It's important, and I love the way people are starting to talk about it in a more healthy way, and yada yada. All that's really good. And it's non-existent. It isn't even in the way that they talk about is this idea of, would you like to? It's not even on the table.
It totally seems like men are the ones in charge and they are the ones that get to decide it. And right. Women's consent is never considered. Now, would you consider this, like, even if the woman is fine with it, like, afterwards, the fact that they don't consider, women's consent and they seem to force women into marriages, mm-hmm. Do you consider this a form of sexual slavery?
I kind of do. And it's a weird thing to say out loud, right? The way it is talked about, this is a thing that is forced on women. You can call that what you want, right? But that is how it is talked about. And that is the piece that plays out for people still, is this kind of entitlement of men, for men feeling entitled over women's bodies, regardless of how these relationships actually, as you noted, right, how they actually played out afterwards and yada yada, and if everybody's actually fine with it, or they learn to enjoy each other, learn to get to know each other, whatever. The way in the biblical text it's talked about, yes, it does sound to me like that is biblical marriage. Mm-hmm. Is something forced on a woman.
Yeah, when I've talked about this before, I brought up, and I can't remember the historian's name, but he was a Roman historian who talked about forced marriages, and how that is like a forced marriage is a type of sexual slavery.
It is.
And
I
yeah,
agree. I mean,
it seems to be like a hard topic for a lot of people to talk about. There's visceral reactions on both sides of the aisle as far as like the theological aisle here of between atheists and Christians, to some of these points. And I mean, I could tell that you're kind of struggling even right now, like talking about this. I don't know if that's because it's kind of like a new way to look at it, or if
no,
it's
it's
because
not.
of the nature of it. Oh, okay.
Yep, it's not new to me to consider that language. It's it's I'm interested in getting people to just look at what is being said and all these pieces, and I do think that what you've said is a part of it, but w you know, is it all RAPE? Like, is that what it is, right? And on a certain level, that is how it is talked about, and
Mhm.
at the same time, I want people to look at some of these other pieces, and I worry that making these claims keeps people from hearing all these other things as well, right? So that, well, she thinks that marriage in the Bible is just men raping women, and so I'm not gonna pay any attention to anything she has to say. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I totally get that. It's like their brain just instantly shuts off.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Find a
Yeah.
reason to not pay attention because all
Yeah.
these other things are also very uncomfortable.
Well, and speaking of sexual assault, the kind of a weird segue, I guess.
Yeah.
So the other argument that I make is that in Matthew and Luke's version of the Jesus's conception, um, it definitely does not consider Mary's consent, and therefore it seems like it's a non-consensual impregnation of Mary, which I guess I'm interpreting impregnation as being an inherently sexual act. So like the fact that she is impregnated without her consent makes it seem, rapey to me. Um, Sorry, what do you think about that interpretation of that story?
Yeah, I do wanna clarify, it's in Luke. It's in Matthew's version, she isn't even in the story in Matthew's version. In Matthew's
Oh
version,
yeah.
Gabriel comes to Joseph, and that they have a conversation. In Luke, it's very rapey to me. Um, because she's not given, p your highly favored one, and there's a lot of echoes with Hebrew Bible women, getting pregnant, who thought they couldn't, and highly favored one, and yada, yada, yada. But in Luke, uh, you know, it might almost be good to pull it up, but in Luke, it's, okay, highly favored, you were chosen, for this thing. What are her again, it's the what are her options? She can't say no. She's just being told that God has chosen you for something special, so aren't you lucky? And the language that's used says that the Holy Spirit will overpower you. Like,
Yeah.
that scares me, right? Like, as a
Oh, yeah.
female, thinking about being overpowered by someone else, um, I was trying to think, yeah, it's definitely after it's
Yeah, I believe that's it right there. The birth of Jesus foretold.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yes, thank you. Starting in verse 28, Gabriel came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." She was perplexed by his words and wondered what kind of greetings might be. The angel said, "Do not be afraid," because that's how people respond when an angel shows up, is they're actually afraid. Um, "Mary, for you have found favor with God," and that's the language that's used with all these women, Hannah, like, get pregnant. "And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, and he will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He'll reign, yada yada." And she's like, "Okay, how can this be? Because I've not known a man." And he says, "Oh, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy. He will be called Son of God." And then her response in verse 38. here I am, the servant, the slave of the Lord. It's not servant in the Greek, it's slave. Let it be with me according to your word. What are her options, right? I mean, people say, yeah, well, she responds and she welcomes it and she greets him. Like, that is one way of reading it. And I get that. I get why people read it that way. That's not how I read it, because this is coming out of nowhere. This isn't a welcome surprise. In Hebrew Bible, all those women are depicted desperately wanting a child, and now they're given one. This is very different. And yeah, you can read that the Holy Spirit will come upon you and the power of the most high will overshadow you. You can read that however you want to, but that does not sound fun to me.
No, it definitely doesn't. It sounds incredibly like kind of a rapey situation there.
Yes, being over, yeah, anyway, that's how I read it, and many people do, and females who have been assaulted in this way tend to read it that way and are not comfortable with it. Not all, of course, but I'm just saying that that resonates with their experience, and so that is something to me that I think we should pay attention to and at least consider.
Yeah, so I've had some pretty wild conversations with people on this particular like way to view this story, because obviously they're very tied to, Jesus's conception and everything.
Right.
And I had one guy that was trying to argue, like he was totally confused what I meant by like that God was kind of rapey, right? And so I I made my argument to him, and it got to the point where he was really scrambling in order to make a coherent argument. And and he said he got to a point, and he didn't say the full phrase, but he said, "And she liked it." And I'm like, "Oh my God, don't tell me you just said that."
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's so crazy, and this seems to be like a lot of Christian men out there that have this kind of view about women in the Bible, like another passage that I was going to talk about, but we're kind of running out of time here. Was Numbers 31, where the Israelites slaughter an entire group, keep the young virgin girls for themselves. A lot of the pushback they get on that is like, well, what else are they supposed to do? Like, this was a good thing for them. It's like, hold on, wait a second. Their entire family was just slaughtered, and then they're forced into marriages to Israelite like men. Like, is that
caused
your
that
response?
slaughter.
Is yes, exactly. And it's really the kinds of arguments are really weird. What's your take on Numbers 31 right here? I know this is kind of like right here at the end. I'm so sorry
that's
to
okay.
dump this on you.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I haven't read it in a while, but the general passage I'm familiar with. What essentially my response the thing I'd like to say here is that so many things in the Bible are like this. Please sit with what is being said. These women are being taken home by the men who just killed their family. Think about that for a minute. How would you like that? What would that be like for you if someone came to town, killed your entire family, and then forced you to go be their sex slave? And when people say, well, it's in order for them to survive, I'm like, you know what? I'm sorry. Fuck you. Women can survive on their own. Right?
Yeah.
Just no. And so when you raise the point about Christian men being this way, what I think is happening there is the thread throughout the scriptures for Christians is that men get to have a say over women's bodies. I mean, that is why we keep seeing Christian men in the legislatures around this country making laws over women's bodies, because they think they can. They've been able to do it so far. They get to do it, blah, blah, blah. There are laws there are laws still on the books, although most of them have been repealed, but there were laws in the state of Tennessee. The people had to bring it forth 15 years in a row to make a law saying that a man could actually RAPE his woman. Men were saying, she's my wife, I can do whatever I want. And so it's not possible for that to apply to this situation. But oh, yes, it is possible. Thank you very much. But the fact that, yes, like you're saying, in the year 2020, in the year whatever, year 2004 is when it was overturned finally. 15 years in a row. They brought it, and too many men said, no, it's not possible for me to do that to my woman. I'm like, yes, it is. So why are so many Christians informed in such an unhealthy way about relationships? It's primarily because their scriptures have given them only examples where men get to do what they want with women's bodies.
Mm-hmm.
No communicate. What is actually a good, healthy relationship advice? None of that shows up in the Bible, right? Communication, listening, empathy. You know what I mean? Like being thoughtful of what your partner needs or wants. Actually asking them what they need or what, like, none of that is in the Bible. Just a man taking a woman and doing what he wants with her. Like, don't have sex with the women in your family. Like, that's the extent of relationship advice.
Yeah, it's incredibly bad advice, and I feel like the relationship that God is depicted as having with Israel, as well as the kinds of relationships that are in both the Hebrew Bible and the Newer Testament,
Mhm.
I think that it's all very toxic. Like it's
It is.
toxic, a representation of a relationship, but
Absolutely.
but that's how they're taught that relationships are supposed to be. So it's
That is
like,
exactly, and that's actually chapter 9. What are they modeling in my book?
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Like I said, I'm on page
I know, you're in
77.
chapter 4, yeah. Oh, good.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm with you. And that's exactly, it's spot on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Bird, I really appreciate you coming here and having this discussion today. I've had a lot of fun, and this has been really great, like having a lot of these thoughts that I've been having, validated, especially even before, like I've been running, these arguments I've been talking about, like before I picked up your book. And then when I picked up your book, I'm like, I've noticed that too, kind of thing,
Right, right. You're
and,
just paying
and so
attention. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm so it feels very validating that it's
Good,
like
good.
it's not just me that's being like,
That's right.
I guess what they would call too woke or something like
Right?
that.
No,
Yeah.
right. You're paying attention.
Mhm.
It's important so that we
So
can separate its effect on us, right?
right. Yeah, and, like I said, I really appreciate you coming by.
Thank
Do you
you.
want to, let everybody know where they can find you? And any final thoughts that maybe something we didn't get to, in the main part of the interview?
I think my main thoughts about this issue, marriage in the Bible, what do the texts say? Like, what do they actually say? That's my main thing here. Right? Let's pay attention to what it actually is saying. And it is very, as we've discussed, it is a man's world, a man having um, dominion over women's bodies. There is no consent. I mean, I think there are a lot of really important things. There is no they weren't even using the same language that we do. They didn't even have a verb yet to marry. So they're thinking about it all very differently than we want to today, or that most people are doing today. That's a piece that I really want people to be clear about, the gap, the difference, right? Marrying for love, that's just 150 years old. That's not been a thing for all time, right? It's so far removed from that in what we see, and yet people continue to read these stories and are informed by them. That is a big piece of why we still have men thinking they get to control women's bodies today, whether it's in legislation or in a intimate situation. So for me, I think that's maybe the main takeaway I would want to wrap up on here. Um, the way people can find me, thank you for that. The easy thing to say is to go to my website, which is my full name, Jennifer with 2 N's, Bird, BIRD.com, because I have links to my YouTube channel and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram there. But I also do a weekly live stream that I call story time. And it's really fun. Sometimes I'm reading biblical stories and just engaging them with my kind of full on commentary. And then sometimes I'm bringing on other biblical scholars and talking about them and their life story and who they are has informed what they do and the work that they've created that's really important. So really kind of a fun conversation every week that I do right now it's at 3 p.m. on Thursdays. But anyway, so I have a whole bunch of content there on my channel, which is at Jennifer Bird PhD. That's how you find me on YouTube if you want to. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm delighted that you wanted to have me on for this conversation. So thank you for your time.
Yeah. No, trust me, I'm the one that is thankful for you coming on here. Because like I said, I think that this is an important conversation to have, and I've really been sort of focusing on this in my conversations with people about the Bible, and when they want to try to use the Bible in order to suggest that there should be some kind of like norm that's applied to all of society,
Yep.
kind of thing.
Spot on.
And yeah. And so that's why I've been having these conversations, and it's been so validating for me to have like a biblical scholar, say the same things that I've been noticing. So it's been really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to come back if once you get through the rest of the book, you want to have more conversation. I would love to. It's just been really nice.
Yeah, definitely. I'm still, getting my way through it. I'm a bit of a slow reader, so like I read really slow. So
I respect that. You can take it in.
yeah,
You take it one bite at a time. Totally.
Yeah, I've been trying to commit it to my memory palace up here. Trying to
Memory
build.
palace. I like that. Yeah.
But I will have your links down below. I do have a link to your book for anybody that's interested in the description down below. I've got a link to Marriage in the Bible. What do the texts say? It's right here. In case you need to see the cover, it's great read. It's really presented very well, and I'm very much wanting to finish the book. So that's definitely going to be happening.
This is a good sign.
I don't finish many books, so like the fact that I want to finish it is a really good sign for me at least, because everything's great in it. But I will have links to your website as well as your YouTube channel down below, so that people can find you. And I will definitely be hitting that bell on your channel so I can see your live streams.
Thanks.
Because that sounds like an awesome stream to listen in on every week.
Yeah.
So.
It's a fun one.
All right. Well, everybody, go down below into the comment section. Let us know what you thought about the verses that we discussed today. And I'm so glad that Dr. Bird was able to come on for such a long time and discuss all this stuff with us. And don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.